Welcome to this episode of MLM Renegade. Today, guys, we're going to interview Dr. Benjamin Hardy. This is going to be a lot of fun. So here's the million-dollar question. How are network marketers like us, who've tried everything their upline ever suggested to be successful, and yet still struggled, who grew up with technology and aren't stuck in the 20th century, how are we supposed to grow our downlines and our bank accounts, and yet still have time for real life? My name is J.R. McKee. Join me as we explore how to use 21st century learning and technology to grow our downlines and build lasting wealth. Simply put, this is MLM done different. Welcome to MLM Renegade. So a couple of weeks ago, I had this incredible opportunity to interview Dr. Benjamin Hardy. He's the author of a new book called Personality Isn't Permanent. And I had the amazing fortune to actually be able to pre-read this book. And it comes out today. Today is June the 16th. And it is available now. And I highly recommend that you go and pick it up. I will place a link in the description for the podcast to where you can pick it up. It is one of the best books that I have ever read. I'm talking anything that is not written by an ancient prophet or considered scripture. This book is right up there with it. So you guys, I'm really excited to share this interview. It goes a little bit long. This is definitely a longer episode, but the value here is so incredible. Benjamin Hardy also has another book called Willpower Doesn't Work. Also, highly recommend. You guys, this is going to be really cool. So, everybody, you guys, I'm really excited to have with us this morning Ben Hardy, Dr. Ben Hardy. Ben has a PhD in organizational and industrial psychology, I think, and he can correct me if I'm wrong. But Ben and I share some commonalities. We're both definitely fathers of 4+ kids. He's on the plus, I'm at the 4, but and we also share an alma mater, and so we also we do a lot. We have a lot in common. So I was really excited when I was able to actually get him booked for this. Now, Ben has a brand new book coming out called Personality Isn't Permanent. And there'll actually be a link in the description here to go and get that ordered. I wholeheartedly endorse this book. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but I've been reading it and it's amazing. It's fantastic. So Ben, hey man, welcome in. Thanks.
Just happy to be hanging out with you, JR. It's cool.
Yeah, this is cool. You know, I'm excited. So you got me a kind of a pre-release copy of the book, and I was a big fan of Willpower Doesn't Work. You mentioned you saw Ryan Holiday back there. Actually, just above it, you probably can't see, is actually Willpower Doesn't Work. I've got it on the shelf back there. It was in 2018. One of my goals was to read 52 books. And I read and listened to 52, but Willpower Doesn't Work. I actually have the list over here. Let's see, where did it fall? It was number 23, so it was almost dead middle of the year for me. And it was awesome. I got introduced to you by a guy named Nathan Ricks, who's an incredible network marketer, made millions in that industry. And he turned me on to your blog, which Ben was like the most read blogger on medium.com for like 3 years, from 2015 to 18. So the guy can write. So you should get this book. But Ben, tell me, I was actually just telling you a second ago, but there's 2 emails that I read every single morning. I read Ryan Holiday's Daily Stoic, and I read your email because it's a blog post that comes through, and it's the things that you're talking about are so present for me, I guess, is the thing. But tell me kind of, tell me a little bit about your backstory, kind of how you got to this. And it goes into it a little bit in the book, so I've got some idea, but kind of how did you get to be Dr. Hardy from, as you kind of put it in your book, the punk kid in high school, Ben,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so I grew up in Salt Lake City, right where you're living. And the kind of big episodes for me was when my parents got divorced, age 11. We grew up very, religious, And all of a sudden, like with the divorce, it was just exploded. Just like, like my father ended up becoming an extreme drug addict, like in all dimensions. Like it just really, it just devastated him. Like he went through this deep depression. Was in our house literally just became kind of like a crazy place, like drugs everywhere. And that was kind of my life from probably age 11 to 20, really. And
Wow.
I don't know how I graduated high school. My mom was very much going from apartment to apartment, trying to run a health club in Midville. Actually, her and her sister were trying to run a health club, and so she was really busy. It was trying to it was kind of just a small business. So she was very busy, and we had like zero stability. I'm the oldest of 3 boys, and I have no clue how I graduated from high school to this day. I did so much snowboarding and skateboarding. Like I was in playing video games. Like I was very much just avoiding reality to the extent I could because I had zero footing. But basically about a year after high school, I was doing nothing with my life. World of Warcraft, playing video games all day, not having a job. I tried Salt Lake Community College, to be honest with you, for about 2 weeks, tried 2 classes, had zero capability of taking a class. Like I remember trying to read a textbook and my brain literally couldn't process it.
Yeah.
I just didn't know how to learn, and I didn't have a purpose for learning. And so it was suffering to even try to go to school. So I dropped out and just was playing video games and very purposeless. Like during COVID-19, I've reread Man's Search for Meaning a few times, which is such a cool book. But one of the things that Frankl talks about, and obviously that's the book about him surviving the Holocaust, was that the people in that situation, if they didn't have a purpose and a sense of future, if they didn't have hope for a specific future, the present would be too meaningless. Like it was too meaningless to do anything. The suffering led to just death because there was no purpose to the suffering. That was kind of where I felt like I had no future. I had no purpose. I just was like, life felt pretty meaningless. And so I felt like I needed to get that again. And so for me, at about age 19, that was kind of reconnecting with my faith, deciding to go on mission for 2 years, and kind of escaping my situation. So I, went back and just kind of reconnected with my faith. And the church mission for 2 years was the thing that blew my life, blew my mind. I just dove in full board and went through a huge transformation. That's where I really got into journaling. I read tons of books. Like I got special permission to basically read whatever I wanted because I was reading so much. I was reading Covey. I was reading all sorts of stuff on my mission, to be honest.
I wondered about that because I saw that in the book talking about reading 100 books. I'm like, man, I had like 10 books that I could read.
Yeah. My mission president gave me permission because I was waking up early reading. I was reading through lunch. I was just absorbed. And I was, with missions, you're obviously out doing community service. You're out teaching people. So I was going through a lot, but I was journaling and reading like a monster. And so I got permission to just start reading kind of whatever I felt like I needed. And so that experience got me, first off, it just taught me how much a person could change. When you change their context, you change their role, you change their identity, you change their purpose, you get someone motivated on something really meaningful and doing something new, you can change them big time. And so that led me to wanting to be a writer. But I got home from that experience in 2010, and it took until 2015 for me to start writing. And so I finally started writing in 2015, and just quickly it blew up because I was, I'd spent a lot of time at that point studying psychology. I was married at that point. We were at Clemson doing my PhD. I was in the first year of my PhD program. We just gotten our 3 foster kids. And I just felt like at that time, I was like, okay, I need to start now. Yeah, I got to start now.
You don't have enough going on, 3 foster kids, newly married, there's nothing happening.
Yeah. Well, I just felt like I had to, because I felt like, okay, I could get absorbed in this PhD and it'll be like 10 years from the time I'm home from my mission. So I was just like, I kind of felt like I got to start now. And so I just started writing early in the morning before class. And I just wrote, from 2015 to 2018, probably a couple hundred blog posts, but just learned how to do it effectively.
That's awesome. And it's funny because I've played around with that, like it was probably 2007-ish when kind of Blogger was kind of the cool thing and everybody had a blog, and it was like the Facebook wall is now, right? I mean, it's just like, here's a chronicle of your day. And I started writing, and what's funny is you and I both went to BYU for undergrad. I don't have an advanced degree. Frankly, I'll probably never get one. But
probably won't be relevant,
Yeah, well, and I find that, it's funny, and I'll digress for just a minute. I always tell people, and this is a little bit polarizing, but I have a lot of friends who are like, oh, don't you want to go get an MBA? I work professional sales for a living. And I'm like, no. And they look at me like cross-eyed. I'm like, look, the education that you get at University of Phoenix and Harvard are 95% the same. But what the difference is the networks that you're working in. So it's like, for me, if I can't go to a top 10 school, and my grades at BYU weren't that great, but if I can't go to a top 10 school, what's the point? And it was like a lot of the education that I can get, I've gotten on the job in 20 plus years of selling. So, but my so I wrote, but I skipped freshman English until I was a senior at BYU. Like I literally did not take English 115 until I was officially a senior. And what's funny is I actually feel like I write okay. And other people will be, hey, this is really good. But I find this medium a lot more interactive because I like to be able to just kind of free flow and think. In fact, I wrote for the high school newspaper in high school. In fact, that's how I got my senior English credit for as a senior in high school, was I wrote sports articles based on what our high school was doing. But I composed it all at the keyboard. Like I went to the thing, I took some notes, and then I sat down and I just wrote. And it just the education that, the way that they taught us at BYU or anywhere else is just so different. And so I'm a little bit.
I'll be honest, I wasn't really in love with even the PhD experience, but it was really? For me. Yeah. I think I got a lot out of it. I learned how to think differently. I learned how to research and do things like that. But to me, I got it very much for the credential of it, to position myself differently. And, it may open up future experiences that I want, but like, it was definitely not required. And I had many people telling me, why don't you get out of it now that you're like already like successful as a writer? Why are you going to go through and finish with this? And I still have future goals. Like one of the big things I talk about even in Personalities and Permanent is that you can't actually understand someone's process without understanding their goals. And so, like I have goals beyond what I'm doing right now that PhD makes sense for, but if someone's just going to get a PhD so that hopefully they can become a writer like me, there's like zero correlation there.
Yeah. I'm curious, are you willing to share any of those? And if you say no, I'm totally okay with that. But I'm curious.
Yeah, I totally am. So like when I was at BYU, I actually taught at the MTC and I'm really interested in training and development in general. Like obviously a lot of my writing is about motivation, etc. Yeah. But my, organizational psychology is very much like psychology of leadership, organizations, teams, culture, like training. A lot of it's training and development. So like for me, I'm very interested in that subject. And there's many aspects of me that would like to go honestly and work for the missionary department of the church. And, but I'll still write books. Like I see myself writing books long into the future because I love just waking up in the act of writing and I love constantly learning. Yep. For me, I learn a lot through the process of learning and then writing. And I like teaching in this form. But yeah, there's still sides of me that, a lot of those high level training and development positions for like the missionary department, as an example, require a PhD. And so I wanted to get that just as a potential so that if I end up wanting to go that route, honestly, it's very possible that I could do that in a year or two. Like I'm very interested in marketing and the books and stuff. And I'm into like a lot of entrepreneurial activity. I'm way into networks and things like that, but I could see myself going the opposite direction and continuing to write, but totally pivoting and doing something with the church. As weird as that sounds.
That's really cool.
That's why I got the PhD, to be fully honest with you.
That makes a lot of sense. And and if you move back to Salt Lake to do that, we'll have to hang out. So
that'd be cool.
But in the book, and I've read, I wanted to have it done before this interview. In fact, because we scheduled this out like a month ago, and I should have had time, and life gets in the way, COVID-19, blah 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 blah, right? But I'm about halfway through it, and I told you I read 52 books in 2018, and my goal this year is actually to read half that many, but actually read them. So Audible doesn't count anymore. So
That's a big goal.
I'm trying to up the game a little bit, and I'm about
Good for you, dude.
I'm about a book, maybe a book and a half behind right now for that goal. But I like, honestly, at this point, and I'm totally not blowing sunshine here, this is probably one of my top 3 favorite books at this point in time. We talked about Ryan Holiday. The Obstacle is the Way is also one of those top 3 books. Like it just, and I honestly put I put these together in that sort of way because it is so, it literally got me sitting down, and everybody else can't see this, but I mean, literally sat down the other morning and it was like describing my future self. And it's like, okay. And essential. And, but I hadn't thought of it. And I use Brennan Bouchard's planner, his high performance planner, which I'm sure you've run across or seen or maybe even used. I don't know. But, you know, it talks about one of the questions I ask you every day is, you know, who needs your A game today? You know, and sometimes it's something for work or whatever else. But the last few days, it's been like future JR needs that. And just trying to frame things. And one of the things that you talk about is actually, you know, planning out who that person is. And for me, that's, you know, that's JR at 50. And so what does JR at 50 think about what I'm doing now? And what does JR at 50 want, you know, in order to get to that spot, what's the crap that I got to cut out of life? And, you know, one of the other books I've got over here that I've had for a long time is eliminating your SDBs, or your self-defeating behaviors. And frankly, I haven't cracked it in more than 10 years, probably. I know I need to, but those are some of the things that it's in my mind. It's like, okay, what's some of the stupid stuff that I can cut out? For you, it sounds like it was World of Warcraft.
Yeah, and there's plenty of things that I'm doing today that are to the detriment of future Benjamin Hardy. You know, we all are. Like, our behavior right now, unless we're really focused on our future self, is probably reflective of where we're at today. So no matter where you're at today, if you have a future self that's beyond that, then we all have things we need to eliminate to get to our future self. Yeah.
And that, you know, that was one of the things that just, it got me thinking. And I guess that's probably one of the highest praise I can give a book, is it got me thinking, because so often, and I love to read, I'm a spy novel guy, like Brad Thor and Vince Flynn. Like, as soon as their book comes out, I own a hardback copy, and 3 days later it's sitting on the shelf because I finished it. Like, I just consume. I love them. Like, it's just so, because for me, it is literally a movie for my mind a lot of times. But but these sort of books are, you know, they get me thinking and get me laying in bed at night, you know, trying to visualize and imagine things, which is where because I know there's a lot of power in the subconscious mind, especially when you sleep, of connecting dots that you didn't get. And it's fun. Literally this morning, I read your email this morning talking about the first 3 hours of your day. And it gave me some pause to think about, okay, well, like, for example, you don't work out in the morning. Like, you go.
Sometimes I do. I mean, honestly, I wrote that article a few years ago. So, I mean,
okay.
Morning routines are adjustable. You know what I mean? But for a long time I didn't, and still sometimes I don't. I haven't worked out yet. But.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Neither have I. But maybe that's from being old, fat, and lazy. Less about needing to work out. Actually, lately I like to get on, I ride my bicycle. That's kind of with the gyms closed and everything else, that's kind of been my savior, just to go. And, you know, like, I live in Salt Lake, so it is uphill both ways, no matter where I go. Especially if I go, cause I live on the west side of the valley. If I go to the east side of the valley and come back, it's literally,
straight up.
I the other day I rode 25 miles. It was a big loop, basically, and I went west to east, just up to the mouth of Little Cottonwood Canyon, up on Wasatch, basically, and then back down and around to home. And
what road were you on? Like 123rd,
123rd up to Wasatch up and around to 94th, and then back down.
Yeah, I've done a lot of cycling there. Like, when I got home from the mission, I was living in Sandy, and I was getting way into road biking. So I love road biking around there.
Yeah,
a lot of good hills.
Oh, there's lots of good hills. But it's funny, the things that while I'm suffering, and I think that's one of the things that cycling has taught me, is how to suffer. Like that, it's good.
It's really good.
It is good but you know, sometimes obviously, you know, the natural man, I'll call it, wants to avoid that, right? But while I'm suffering, I also get like, oh, hey, what about this? And oh, I need to think about that. And it, you know, getting away from, and that was what your article this morning talked about, is really getting away, you know, active play, and getting away from that, from the deep work that you need to do to be effective. And so, you know, it's just, so I guess pivoting a little bit here, you talk in the book, and in fact, I haven't gotten to this chapter yet, but you talk about kind of trauma. You know, mental trauma. I'm sure it could be physical trauma as well. Like I said, I haven't gotten there. But I guess, how do you define trauma as you're talking about it in the book? And then kind of help me understand your philosophy on how it limits us and where the breakdown is a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So trauma is one of the big things that shapes people's personality. Trauma is essentially any negative experience that you've had that you've attached to. It's become some element of your identity. So trauma can be huge. Like, for example, me growing up in a challenging environment. By the way, just real quick as an example, like I actually talk about this deep in my book. It's important to realize that your past, and this can be tough for people who are defined by the past, but the past is in many ways a fiction. The past is a story. It's a meaning. Your memories can be changed fundamentally. And that's actually the goal, is that your past evolves as you evolve as a person, because you view the past from your current perspective. Mm-hmm. And so the idea is that a trauma is a meaning that you give into an experience. So I actually tell the story of a distant relative of mine who is someone who's brilliant. She's in her 80s now. But so trauma can be big, but it can be also something that would be seemingly small, mm-hmm. but that has an impact on your identity. And so like this relative of mine, brilliant woman, she went to like Stanford, went to Cornell, very educated, really well, like she's a brilliant writer. And for a long time, she's wanted to write and illustrate children's books. But back like maybe 40 years ago, she took a private art lesson. And there was maybe a handful of other people in the lesson. And during one of the exercises, the teacher came up and, took her easel pad and was crossing it out and stuff and correcting her. And while she was being corrected in public, she was very embarrassed. And so she was feeling all sorts of embarrassment, or like wondering, like, he hasn't been correcting anyone else like this. Everyone else is watching. And so in these 30 or 60 seconds while he's correcting her, she forms this idea in her head that I'm not very good at drawing. I must not be very good at this. And so the crucial part about trauma is that there's a meaning developed in an emotional experience. We all have negative emotional experiences, and we have to choose the meaning we give to those experiences. In this case, with this situation, the meaning, we call it a cognitive commitment in psychology. It's basically like you commit to an idea, but it has implications to your identity. So like her cognitive commitment was, I'm not very good at drawing. And as a result, she never actually chose. So with emotions, there's your initial reaction, and then there's your secondary reaction, which is where we call it emotional regulation. You actually choose how you want to frame the experience. And for her, she never did that. With trauma, there is no emotional regulation. There's no reframe. There's no choosing of the meaning. Because all you do is actually you create meaning based on your emotions, and then that meaning dictates your identity and your choices. And so, there's a really good book on trauma, actually. So just to fast forward for her, sure. Now 40 years forward, I was having a conversation with her at a family reunion. I was hearing about these things and I was shocked. And I said, I learned for the first time that this person wanted to write children's books, but she never did. And I said, well, why don't you write children's books? And she said, I'm not good at drawing. 40 years later. And I was like, well, do you think you could have gotten good at drawing in those 40 years? No, I don't have the ability. And that's kind of a crucial aspect of a fixed mindset. But that kind of is reflective of trauma or unresolved negative experiences. And so there's a really good book called The Body Keeps the Score. It's essentially the definitive book on trauma. But one of the big things that, and honestly, reading that book is what led me to writing Personality Isn't Permanent. But one of the things, so I read that book in 2018 and was shocked because I was actually very interested in addiction. That's why I wrote Willpower Doesn't Work. I mean, there was many reasons, but I was turned on to the idea that trauma, and I didn't talk much about trauma and personality and Willpower Doesn't Work, but I was turned on to the idea that trauma is one thing that obviously leads people to addiction. So I read that book and then learned all about how it shapes personality. And I was like, okay. So anyways, one of the things that Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote that book, said is that trauma freezes your personality. It essentially, because your personality and really just growth in general and learning is about emotional development. It's about becoming more and more flexible and adaptive to difficult situations. It's really good from my perspective to look at personality as your comfort zone. Anything outside of your comfort zone is a different way of doing things than you would typically do it. And so you have to deal with emotions outside your comfort zone. And you have to become more emotionally flexible or adaptive. And that's really how you learn. What happens with trauma, though, is that you have this negative experience and you become very emotionally rigid. You become locked up in your thinking, like this person I was describing, very black and white. I can't do it, rather than I could learn it.
Yep.
And so when you experience difficulty or when you're outside your comfort zone, you quickly retreat because you're not emotionally flexible. You're not willing to deal with it. One other just quick aspect of trauma is that you're defined by a negative past experience rather than choosing to be defined by a future experience. And so for her, her goal to become a writer disappeared, and she was just defined by the past. And that's a crucial aspect is that it limits your imagination, your hope, and your desires for the future. And you're only defined by the past. And so obviously all of us have aspects of our lives where maybe there was an experience we had, big or small, that stunted our growth or that led us to a fixed mindset in some form or fashion where we don't believe we could change in various ways. And so we then potentially pursue different goals that may be less than what we wanted, but we're not willing to go through the emotional development to become the kind of person that could have what we want. Instead, we limit ourselves and we stick within our comfort zone.
Wow. Awesome. Framing it that way, that your personality is your comfort zone. Like I hadn't thought of that, but you're totally right. I mean, in a lot of my own personal development, I've kind of become a personal development junkie a little bit, especially as my wife and I have been doing, some network marketing stuff for the past couple of years, and that's where MLM Renegade spawned off of. But getting outside your comfort zone and getting outside of and worrying more about what you think than what other people think that's hard. Because like you said, I mean, trauma is that thing that's holding us back, and our future self or our current self doesn't want to experience that trauma again. We're protecting ourselves. It's self-preservation a little bit. It's, hardwired.
You can build a huge wall around your comfort zone. You know what I mean? Where like you certainly don't want to even touch feeling that again.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it can vary. To me, trauma shrinks your comfort zone. It shrinks what's possible to you. It shrinks what you're willing to do. That's why it leads to emotional rigidity. I mean, to start, that's why I like the quote that all progress starts by telling the truth. Obviously a key aspect of moving forward, you need two things. You need to reframe the past. You need to choose new meanings, and choose new stories, because your identity, and just so everyone knows, identity and personality are two different things. Identity is how you define and describe yourself. Personality is how you consistently behave and act, essentially. And so your identity actually drives your personality. Identity is 10 times more important. Like personality, in my opinion, isn't the thing to focus on. Actually, it is identity, but personality is the byproduct.
Got it.
And so, when you're describing yourself, and you speak in definitive terms, I'm not good at math, or I can't draw, or I'm an introvert. Very strong definitive statements are identity statements, which then drive behavior and personality. And so from my perspective, it's important to view your former self as a different person. Your former self is not someone who would make the same decisions as you. The 11-year-old version of me was making meanings from my experience with my parents and stuff that the 32-year-old version of me does not have to make. Yep. I have probably a better view and context, and I can see those experiences, and I can even see my former self from a different perspective. I can have empathy towards my former self, but I don't have to see the world as my former self does. And that's actually a key aspect of trauma, is that usually you still have the same perception as you did from the experience, and you should be expanding your perception. Just one quick thing I want to throw in is that my dad actually is no longer a drug addict. He's overcome that stuff. He actually overcame a lot of that when I was on my mission. We've become great friends, but there's a really good book, actually, I would recommend any listener. It's called Too Soon Old, Too Late Smart. It's by a guy who's dead now. He's a psychiatrist named Gordon Livingston, but he talks a lot about narration, because your identity and narrative is one of the big things that shapes your personality. Trauma is one.
What was that one more time? I'm literally going to write it down.
Yeah, it's called Too Soon Old, Too Late Smart. And it's a short book, but it's a power puncher. It's less of a self-help, although it's pretty self-helpy, but it's more like therapeutic, but it's deep. It supports, for you and anyone who's going deep into the self-help world, it supports this. It's just a level or two deeper.
Yep.
But he talks a lot about your story, in the past, and about how your past is literally just a story. And so you have to be the one to choose it, but also you choose if the people in your story in the past are heroes or villains. Like, that's your choice, and it's the meaning you gave. In the case of my relative, the meaning that she gave to that experience was that she's not good at she's not good at drawing. She could have given any other experience. She could have said that this teacher really cares about me and he's giving me incredible feedback. Like, And so like, it's your choice, the meanings you give, but also when you're reframing the past, you have to reframe them. So for me, as an example, I no longer view my experiences growing up as negative experiences. It's a really good framing to view your past as something that happened for you, not to you.
Not
If
to
it
you.
happened to you, then it's actually still unresolved. If it happened for you, then you're learning from it and you're no longer going to repeat it. It's like, oh, this happened for me. I learned a lot from this. Like with Willpower Doesn't Work, when I launched it, it did not go to plan. It was, it's actually sold very, considerably well compared to most books, but it did not do what I wanted it to do because I made a lot of bogus mistakes. And for a long time, I was like, gosh, I was mad at a lot of things that happened. But now it's like, clearly that happened for me so that I don't repeat it, so that I can do better things in my future. And so that's really how you want to frame the past.
That's awesome. It's funny. I was having a conversation with my second oldest, my oldest daughter, who's she'll turn 17 next month. So you get, you at least the age there. And she's taking the college entrance exams and wants to go to BYU like her old man, and grandma and grandpa before.
It's a great school.
Yeah. And but she took her first stab at one of these tests and did not do well. And I said to her, and it's funny as you bring this up, I said to her, I'm like, oh, you probably got a little bit too much of your old man in you, and that I didn't do well in exams. I don't take tests well. And I said it that way. I don't take tests well, as opposed to I didn't used to take tests well. And I've learned obviously a lot. And thankfully I don't have any academic exams to worry about anymore. But and now it's got me thinking of like, okay, how do I frame this conversation with her now and in a way that's going to be positive? And it's got me thinking of other things, but it's, one of the ways is, okay, we got her a tutor. My little sister, her aunt is actually a Princeton Review or a Princeton, the Princeton Review.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. Princeton. Yeah.
Yeah. A Princeton, she was a tutor. They live in Austin, Texas. And so I texted my sister. I'm like, hey, are you still doing like Kaplan stuff? He's like, yeah. She's like, it's Princeton, but yeah, same thing. And I'm like, you want to help out Michaela? And she's like, yeah, absolutely. And I'm like, okay, well,
that's huge.
What do you charge? I'm not going to assume that, she's getting paid doing this. So she's like, no, I'll do it for free. She's like, wait, I'll do it for free, but you got to pay for the books to get shipped to her. I'm like, done. Tell me how much I'll Venmo you. Right. But I mean, she's giving her, what could be, conceivably, $1,500 or $2,000 worth of free tutoring. And
that's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. And so when my daughter retakes that test, whenever they reschedule it after, pandemic issues, I'm more confident that she'll do well. Now I'm more confident. It's a lot more important for her to be more confident, I know. And those will be conversations we have here over the coming weeks and months. But
there's a TED Talk I'll have you share with her. So One of the best books I've ever read is Mindset by Carol Dweck. Have you ever gone through that one?
Fantastic.
Yeah. To me, her work in the world of psychology is probably some of the most important. And it's so deep. It keeps going deeper and deeper.
Yeah.
But she gave a 10-minute TED Talk. And one of the things that she talks about is that it's important when you get a score, for example, on a test like this, and your daughter's got this score and it can be a little devastating. Rather than thinking about it in terms of the score, she talks about how you should reframe it to not yet. Because when you think about if you score yourself as not yet versus just whatever the score is, then it allows you to focus on the learning curve, that you're back in the future.
Yep.
She also talks about, fixed versus growth mindset, and about how when someone experiences difficulty, if they have a fixed mindset, when someone with a fixed mindset, the moment they experience difficulty, the meaning that they give to difficulty is, I'm not smart. Whereas someone with a growth mindset, as soon as they experience difficulty, the meaning that they give to that is, I'm getting smarter. And so it's interesting, but she talks a lot about how yet is really important because it takes you away from the tyranny of now. Because right now, your daughter might not be there, but she's not there yet.
Yeah.
But one of the other things about having a clear future self, so your daughter, getting into BYU, I actually had to go to a year and a half of Salt Lake Community College. I freaking aced my way through that, and I did get to BYU. So there are multiple paths to the same destination. Yep. But anyways, when it comes to this test, there's a lot of research on deliberate practice, and I talk about that in the book. But Malcolm Gladwell, he popularized the 10,000 hour rule, but it's not really that's not actually it, because you can do something for 10,000 hours and not get better at it. You
Yeah.
can repetitiously do the same thing and actually get worse. Deliberate practice means that you do have things like tutors or coaches, and you have a very specific future version of yourself, which you see yourself as. Like, you want to see that, and so in her training to become that, the deliberate practice of her getting there, she can't actually go through the training process involved unless she's got that very specific goal of hers and seeing herself at that level of the test. And then that's why the goal shapes the process. And the process is only as good as, it gets you to the goal.
Yeah.
But you can't engage in deliberate practice without a clear future self. And then obviously you need to go through that. And that's actually, it goes back to Frankl, that Frankl said without a clear purpose or a bigger goal, the present loses meaning, and the suffering in the present is not worthwhile. But when you have a clear why and you have a clear future self, then the present can become transformational.
Yeah. No, that's, oh man, so good. You talk a little bit about, well, one of the things, you start the book off with basically saying that the personality test craze is awful. And there's definitely some empirical evidence to back that up, that Facebook quit doing them, which, okay, for start, I mean, that was the most commonplace. How many times did you see which Disney princess are you, or what?
Exactly.
All those stupid things, and like half the time, like my favorite one was, which Top Gun character are you? Top Gun's one of my all-time favorite movies. So like, saw that one.
Which one were you, man? Who were you?
I think I was like Slider or something. I don't know. Some random, definitely not Goose, Maverick, or Ice, right? Those are the big ones. But so just briefly, kind of talk about why it's harmful. Like, Myers-Briggs and everything else. Like, talk about that for a minute.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you're thinking about personality, like, one of the things I was surprised at when I was going through the PhD, and a big aspect of what we do is developing tests. You can't really do science without testing. And so I all of my professors over and over and over would tell me about tests like Myers-Briggs, Enneagram. All of those tests are junk science. They're not good. They're not valid. They're not reliable. Valid meaning they're not actually studying what they say they're studying, and reliable meaning you're not going to consistently get the same score. Like, there's all sorts of variables about why you get the score you get, but so they're not good science, but in my opinion, they do a lot of terrible things for people's identity. People do like them because they give people a sense of identity. They give people a sense that, like, oh, like, that's something I didn't know about myself. And so I think to some degree they could be illuminating to some people. I think if you've done a lot of work on your former and your future self, and if you go through a lot of journaling and you're a goal-oriented person, like, I don't know if they're going to actually give you that much new information. But what they do for people is they give people an identity. They give people a story that they can now use to explain themselves. I am an INTJ, or I'm a white, or I'm a blue, or I'm a 6. Like, that becomes their story, which they can then use to explain themselves to other people so that they can relate to each other. Okay. So it's nice to have an identity, and those people kind of give you a fast food version of one. But the problem with identity is that it then becomes something that you try to defend. Like, if you've taken something as a strong part of your identity, first off, you become mindless to all the times the label's not true. So, like, labels create tunnel vision. They lead you to thinking that the label is actually always true when it's not. So, like, in psychology, we call it selective attention. You only see what's relevant to you. When you buy a new car, you start to see that car everywhere on the road. If you're into cycling, you'll notice cyclers. Like, if I'm not into cycling, I'm not going to notice the things that you notice. And so when you have a label, you notice the things that are relevant to the label, but you don't notice everything else. And so, like, if someone has defined themselves as depressed, they'll think they're always depressed. But if you actually looked at them throughout a day, there'd be many times when they actually were feeling good, but they didn't pay heed to those. And so one big problem is that you actually think that the label is accurate when actually it's only slightly accurate. In a lot of different situations, you're not going to project that. But the biggest problem from my perspective that I have with these is that they actually overemphasize your current view of yourself. They stop you from actually imagining a different version of your future self, which would be slightly different than the strong definitions you give of your current self. Like, you actually want to hold your current self a little bit more loosely. There's actually a really good book. I'll give another book recommendation, but the book is called It's Not How Good You Are, It's How Good You Want to Be. And, like, future self is about not where you're at right now. It's about where you want to go. And a big problem with these tests is that they give you a very strong sense of present identity. And then you use it as a strong label. I am X. I am an introvert. When that's actually, first off, it's not always true. Everyone actually displays different versions of themselves.
Yep.
It's also important to realize no one is the exact same person they were in the past. And there's a lot of research that goes into this, like there's a TED Talk called The Psychology of Your Future Self. But this guy, Daniel Gilbert, he's at Harvard. He studied this for a long time. Most people, if you ask them the question, are you the exact same person you were 10 years ago? Most people say not even close, Yep. And so it's good to actually view your former self as someone different. Very good also to view your future self as someone who's very different. And so if your former and your future selves are different people than you are today, and if you're someone who's seeking growth, then what you don't want to do is you don't want to overly defend and confirm your present identity. But that's what these tests do. And actually, that's what people tend to do. That's why Daniel Gilbert said, human beings are works in progress that mistakenly think they're finished, is because we really like to think that who we are today is who we're always going to be. And that's like the worst thing you could do for growth. Yeah. So it's better to not take your current identity so seriously and to more focus on the person you want to be. That allows you then to be in a growth mode.
It's funny you say that, because that was one of the things I picked up on in the book as well, was that you talked about nobody thinks they're the same person they were 10 years ago, and everybody can relate to that. But everybody in that study said, or the vast majority said, no, they'll be the same person they are today or in 10 years. And it's just like, it was kind of an aha. It's like, okay,
we think that who we are is who we are. But 10 years ago, we thought the same thing.
We thought exactly. We thought the same thing. We look at it like, I look at it like growth in housing, for example, okay, or in a neighborhood, right? The neighborhood that I live in, we've lived in for about 10 years, and it's very different today than it was 10 years ago. And 10 years from now, the houses will then at that point be 20 years old. And you think about going into a neighborhood that has 20-year-old houses now, and what do they look like? One of two things happens. It's either full of renters and they're in they're in disrepair, or they've been fully remodeled. Like you grew up in Salt Lake. Pepperwood in the Salt Lake Valley is incredible homes that you can tell were built in the 80s as these incredible homes. We have a friend who's remodeling one of these houses right now, and frankly, it looks awful like right now, but they're in the middle of this huge remodel. And we went over to their house the other day, and they were talking about it. We're like, oh, okay, yeah, we're here where there's this like sunken living room area. Actually, where you're standing right now is going to be the master closet, and over here's the master bath, and we're building an extension over here that's actually going to be the master bedroom, and it'll all flow this way. And it's like, okay, I'm seeing this as like they're seeing the potential.
Of course.
I chuckle because I travel for work a fair bit, and when I do that, like the channel that always comes up is like HGTV, like Home and Garden Network TV, right? It's all like remodeling houses and doing refurbs and whatever else. But I'm always fascinated to see people who can see kind of in fact, one of the shows on there is called like Good Bones or something, where basically they take these houses and strip them down to the studs and reconfigure things and turn them into these incredible modern looking houses or on the inside, whereas they're could have been built in the 1920s on the outside. And maybe it's because I grew up in like a 20-year remodel project. I grew up in the Seattle area, and literally the house I grew up in was built in 1935. When we were remodeling it, we pulled 1935 issues of the Seattle Times out of door jambs that had been shoved in for like insulation, and lath and plaster walls, and just craziness. And so I think that's probably part of where I get it. But to see the transformation of that house that I grew up in, I mean, we did it room by room. I tell people, and I chuckle about it, but I grew up in the country. Like I grew up in the sticks. It was 15 minutes to get anywhere, to get to the grocery store, and but we had all this plaster that came off the walls, and we had to do something with it to get rid of it. We lived on an acre. So literally my parents had me go out in the backyard and dig a hole to put this plaster in. But this was plaster for like a 3,200 square foot house. So it's not like a small amount of plaster. It was every single wall in the whole house. So literally this pit was 6 feet deep 8 feet wide and 40 feet long. It was a trench. I mean, I kidded at the time that it was like a mass grave. It was a mass grave for all the walls in our house. But I learned a lot having to dig the hole and expand it as we went, and carrying 5-gallon buckets out full of plaster to dump it out there. And it was probably, I didn't put it right in the backyard. It was back a little bit. So it was work. But that work taught me some stuff. We talked about cycling and learning to suffer, learning to deal with your present state. I'm sad they just announced that it was going to go virtual, but Huntsman Cancer does a yearly ride on Father's Day weekend that's 140 miles. And I've done it twice. This year was going to be the third time, and they just pushed it virtual. But it's amazing what happens when you I remember getting so they had a 75-mile ride, and then they had a 140-mile ride. And they had some shorter distances as well. But we got to the 75-mile turnaround, which is like 37 miles. I'm like, oh, no, I feel good. I don't need to turn around right now. Yeah, well, it's that next stretch and then coming back to there that was just so painful. And you get past that mile, say 45, 50, and you're like, oh, gosh, my back is starting to hurt, or my shoulder's getting stiff from sitting on this saddle or whatever else. And you just kind of got to sit there and deal with it and keep your legs moving and keep going. And that, like, trying to apply that thought to the rest of everything that I do, especially, whether it be cycling or life in general. You've got 5 kids, that it is rarely, lollipops and rainbows. Except I've seen your twin girls. Okay. That makes me miss things, but, oh man, they're adorable. But, those are the sort of things that it feels like my personality has grown when I started cycling. One of the guys,
I believe it.
One of the guys that I consider a mentor is Russell Brunson, and I'm sure you know Russell. And
I do.
He claims to be an introvert, but if you see anything that he puts out to the world, he is like so wildly over the top that his work personality and who he is to Colette, his wife at home, I'm convinced are 2 entirely different people.
There's nothing abnormal about that either.
Yeah.
When you'll get into chapter or whatever it is on an environment, like role is one of the biggest things that predicts personality, and his role as the online influencer that he is predicts who he wants to be as that persona, like he projects a Russell Brunson that sure is true to himself to some degree, but it's not like it's who he is in every role in his life.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why context really matters, and that a single score on a test couldn't predict all of those various roles or contexts that Russell's in.
Yep.
But I also think it would be wise if I was to talk to Russell, and I know him quite well actually, but like calling yourself an introvert really doesn't help. Yes, he feels that is true of him in many aspects of his life, but to me, it doesn't really help anything. Like to me, it's a self-justification, which we all do. We all justify various elements of ourselves, but it's, just as you described, it's obvious that Russell actually isn't an extra introvert. Like he may feel that way in many areas of his life, where he may need solitude, but to call yourself that doesn't actually help you in the future. It doesn't solve anything.
I wonder if he does it in many ways to be relatable.
It's strategic. Yeah, it's strategic. 100%.
To be relatable to other people, so they can't say, "Oh, I can't do that." We're like, "Well, if Russell can, I can."
No, it's 100%. Russell is very strategic in everything he does. But it's not that he's being dishonest. As someone who's in the public eye, it's someone who's in front of people, who does, he definitely needs some downtime, as we all do.
Yeah.
And so, basically, what he's saying is I need downtime. And so I'm also an introvert, and this is sometimes scary for me because I'm stepping out of my comfort zone to do this. So therefore you can do it as well.
Yeah. And that's a big deal. So yeah, I went to Funnel Hacking Live back in end of January in Nashville, and it was awesome. It was great. Learned a ton, and but it was fun. So well, we're coming up on our hour. This episode, frankly, has been really enlightening for me and awesome, and longer than most of my episodes. Most of my episodes are kind of 30 minutes on the long end. This will be a longer one, so, and I'm excited for that. But I guess as a parting shot, Ben, kind of what tell us about. Obviously, you've got your books. I know you've got some programs as well. Tell us about what you're doing and how how everybody can follow you and plug in. If they haven't picked up Willpower Doesn't Work, I'll have a link for that as well, because it was awesome. And yeah, tell me, how can they do it?
Absolutely. So yeah, Personality Isn't Permanent. You can get the book anywhere. Definitely recommend it. I think the book will surprise you in many ways. This is an intense book,
Yeah.
but there's about 150 journal prompts throughout. I mean, I'm glad that you got you straight to journaling about your future self. There's prompts throughout. Yeah,
I actually wanted to ask you about that, because what do you have any, because I journaled, I served a mission as well, and was every day I journaled every single day, and as soon as I got home I stopped. Like, it literally, and that's kind of that's definitely a regret.
It's a good example of how environment changes behavior, right?
Absolutely. But it's been fun as my oldest has left on a mission, to talk to him about what I've, like, oh yeah, I remember a time when, and going back and looking at those journals. But do you use any particular method or a particular journal or a particular anything, or do you just kind of open up a book and write?
Lined paper, baby. Yeah. To me, I have my own strategies and methods, but like for me, journaling has a few functions. One is obviously recording the past if you want to. To me, it's about clearing mental fog, mental and emotional fog. So like when you woke up today and you were dealing with some stuff, whatever you're dealing with, complexity of work, being on this podcast, like dealing with helping your daughter, like there's so many things. And a lot of it's just, if you write it down, so one of the things that Frankl talks about is that emotions which are suffering cease to be suffering when you give them a clear picture. So a big aspect of journaling is honestly just writing about where you're at, so that you can actually just continue to have a clear mind. That's why people often write 2 to 3 pages a day. It's just, it literally allows you to have clarity. Second, you can use your journal to reframe or choose better meanings for your experiences, even today, COVID-19, the past, how you want to handle it. Like, so it's a way for you to be in touch with yourself so that you can choose how you frame things, and also to clear your mind and your emotions. But it's also just a great thing to use as a daily visualization tool. So for me, I'm big at getting into a clear environment, obviously no distractions, prayer, meditation beforehand, and getting yourself in the right frame of mind, where obviously the night before your subconscious has been doing a lot of great work. There's so many amazing ideas that I get in my journaling just by giving myself 5 to 15 minutes. And for me, it's not just about writing about what I did yesterday or recording history. Like, that's a different form of journaling than this, although you can kind of include that within this. But for me, it's mostly about giving myself the space to visualize my future self, clear my thoughts, and also to potentially get insights that would not have been available to me had I not given myself the 10 to 15 minutes to think. Like, I get a lot of ideas while I'm just sitting and writing that I'm like, gosh, I got to do that today. Like, I need to email that person right now. And I wouldn't have gotten that thought if I hadn't given myself the space. So for me, I'm not overly structured. I don't have the 5-minute journal with bullet. Like, for me, it's just writing with paper. And often it's really sketchy and ugly. Sometimes it's a little cleaner. But I think journaling as a daily process is really important for staying in touch with your future self, so that you can live intentionally on a daily basis. Because if you're not actually living intentionally, then what you're actually doing is you're living reactive to your situation or to your former self, which is basically you on autopilot. It's just living subconsciously. Whereas if you can put yourself in the right frame of mind to think of your future self, then you can live consciously and intentionally on a daily basis. And that's how you have peak experiences. That's how you actually expand and become more flexible and confident as a person. So to me, it's crucial. But yeah, the book has a ton of journaling prompts throughout it. My website is benjaminhardy.com. Tons of blog posts there, tons of free resources for anyone who buys the book. I give away a deep dive Personality Isn't Permanent course, a journaling course, which 10,000 people have bought, just diving deeper into journaling strategies. And then even at Genius Network, which is like a really big mastermind group for marketers, I actually a couple of years ago did a full live training on all my blogging strategies and all sorts of stuff. I mean, people paid $3,000 to be there. I give away that full thing as well for anyone who just buys the book whenever they see this, whether it's pre-order or just post-order.
I'll be.
There's a lot of free resources for anyone who buys this book.
I'll be a purchaser. That's definitely, even with the free copy. It's funny. I found myself on my iPad actually using the pencil and highlighting stuff as if it were a physical book, so I can go back and I'm like, there's been a lot of ahas here in the last couple of weeks as I've been reading it. So, cool. Well, anything else that you want to share with us before I let you go?
Yeah, I think just as a last thought, I think a core premise of this book is that most people think your personality is innate. They think it's who you are and that you have to discover yourself so that then you can set goals that are based on your personality. And in my opinion, that's a very limiting way to live. That's basically seeing your present self as the be all end all, and that you're not going to change much, which is the opposite of what the science says, but it's also the opposite of what you would want if you're someone who wants to grow. So rather than your goals coming from your personality should actually come from your goals. That's why you would actually set a future self that then forces you to become someone different, more confident, more capable than you are. And that's totally possible. Like your daughter is an example of someone who could become great at taking this test if that's what she decides she wants to do. That's the growth mindset. Yep. And so this is just a book that breaks down other levels to how that works.
Yeah, and it breaks it down really well into consumable pieces. So, yeah, I mean, there's plenty of praise for it. I will give it a hearty endorsement and a great job on writing it. So, Ben, appreciate you being here with us.
Thanks, JR. It was cool, man.
Everybody go pick up the book. There'll be a link in the description of the podcast notes here. And yeah, go check out Personality Isn't Permanent. Thanks a bunch, Ben.
Yeah, dude. Have an amazing day and let's stay in touch.
Hey, thanks for listening, and please remember to subscribe. And if you loved us, leave us an awesome review on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you consume your podcasts. Now, if you'd like some free training for your team on how your recruiting efforts can be bettered and brought into the 21st century, go to podcast.mlmrenegade.com and get your copy of the Renegade Recruiting Kickstarter.